Every year, cameras are getting better. They have more features, sensors are getting bigger, but the price tag keeps growing. We begin to feel this pressure of wanting the latest camera gear. We think once we have it, it will solve our problems. But what if you can't afford the newest gear? Or what if you don't have access of obtaining it? What then? So what if we stopped trying to buy the newest camera? What if we went backwards? That's exactly what we're doing in today's video. Today we're shooting with this, the Nikon D3100. Now I know what you're thinking. How in the world are you going to shoot with this obsolete camera? And to be honest with you, I don't know. But we're gonna find out. To start, let's look at some specs of this camera. This is a Nikon D3100. It came out August 9th, 2010. It has a 14.2 megapixel sensor. It can shoot up to 1080p video with sound. We'll get to the sound part later. And it has an ISO range of 100 to 3200. Again, we'll also talk about this later. The video features that are offered on this camera are, well, lacking. You can choose your quality and frame rates of your video, and you can turn the sound on or off. You also have some picture profile options in another menu, and I just chose the neutral profile so I could color it in post. Now, this video is not sponsored by Nikon, and they did not send this camera to me. It's a joke, because the camera's 13 years old. This is actually my first DSLR camera that I've ever owned. This is a beginner camera, something you start with, but I'm interested to see what kind of images we could create. There was no real plan, idea, or story in mind. I just wanted to go out and see what I could capture. The lenses I used for this camera were the trusty Sigma 18-35 lens, which, if you have a crop factor camera, this is a great lens to pick up. It's 1.8 all the way through, and it's built like a tank. Trust me, I've dropped it one too many times. The other lenses I used was the Nikon 50 1.8, which is a great addition for the camera. It's small, light, very sharp, and balances nicely with the camera. For the longer shots, I used the Nikon 55 to 200. When it came to the image, I felt it was best to lean into the grainy look because it wasn't the sharpest out of camera. And when it came to the color grading, though I couldn't push the image too much, I feel like I was able to create a pleasing look, at least to my liking, I think. The camera's autofocus isn't the best, and so my way around this was just manually focusing the majority of the shots. So, if it's out of focus, it's my fault. I'm sorry. The overall shooting experience wasn't that bad. It's an extremely light camera, the buttons are accessible, and for walking around, it's a great option. Something I noticed that actually made this whole experience very difficult was the auto exposure. Even when I was shooting in manual mode, there still seemed to be some kind of exposure compensation happening. No matter how much I dug through the menu, this was something I couldn't turn off. Although when you shoot photos in manual, you don't have this problem. You can actually see it here. Even though I'm completely in manual mode, it starts adjusting for the sky. Even though I had an ND filter on, it wouldn't let me lock exposure. Here's another shots of some birds flying around. You can see the image gets brighter and darker as I follow the bird along. This made shots with movement very difficult because it wouldn't keep the exposure I set it to. It made pans, tilts, zooms extremely hard to film. In order to compensate for this, I took it out on a cloudy day, hoping that the exposure wouldn't jump around like it had before. I also made sure that all my shots were locked off with no camera movement. I was actually pretty happy with the shots I was able to get, and it felt good to be able to capture something pleasing. Or at least, I thought it looked pretty good. Now I did run into some battery issues with the camera that I wasn't expecting. So it's not dead yet, but I can't go to live view because it just doesn't have enough juice. Which is a bummer because I wanted to get a few more shots, but we've only been out here for like 15 minutes. Which is kind of crazy to think about, that it only lasted 15 minutes. We're doing just 1080 video. I guess having an extra battery, obviously huge. As you can see, the battery's not that big though. This kind of bummed me out because I really wanted to get out and shoot something and go out, and it was like 15 minutes later, that was it. I had to pack my bags up and go home. So now what if we took the camera and tried to film a quick little story? Nothing fancy, but a few clips strung together to capture a moment. Because the camera really struggles with holding exposure, I thought this would be a great test. It's dark, the exposure is constantly changing because of the fire, and I wasn't even going to think about using autofocus. I shot all these clips at 1080p, 24 frames, in the neutral profile it offers on the camera. The way I was able to lock off my shot was I figured out my point of focus, figured out my white balance, and started recording. Remember when I said I would address the sound later? Well, the camera doesn't have a mic jack, so the only audio I was getting was from the internal camera, which wasn't that great. So I actually used Foley sound, which is just sound that I dubbed in later into the video. Knowing that it was going to be dark, I used a light panel, turned it on to like a fire mode so I could brighten up the image just that much more. The funny thing is, every time I was about ready to start rolling, the live view would cut off. You see, when you turn the live view on, you only have 30 seconds before it turns off. Then you have to re-engage by pulling the live view lever. Also, to keep the image from getting noisy, I shot everything at the base ISO of 100. I noticed anytime I would go higher than 100, the noise really starts to creep in. I do this with all my cameras. Despite whatever camera it is, I always shoot at the base ISO. It's where you're gonna get the cleanest image. This is very important to think about going into your next project. Despite some of the quirks with the camera, I actually enjoyed being able to shake off the dust and shoot with it again. It made me appreciate the camera gear I currently have, and in a way, it eliminated the desire to want the newest cameras on the market. Sure, the auto exposure was a pain, but I was able to find ways around it. The rolling shutter made me feel nauseous just looking at it, so I decided to frame my shots differently. And the battery always seemed to die right when I was getting into the flow of shooting, but it made me more intentional with what I was shooting. I really wanted to make do with the camera I had, and despite all the problems, I was still able to make something. That's something to take away from this. The act of doing is still doing. You're still making something and putting it out into the world. And no, it might not be the best camera on the market, but if you always wait for the next best thing for your project, you'll never make your project. Whatever you have and whatever you can afford is the best camera you can be using. Making your film is the most important part. So take the gear that you have and go shoot something with it. I promise, you won't regret it. Hey, if you like this video and would like to see more, make sure to like and subscribe. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask them in the comments below, and we'll see you guys in the next video.